American cinema, much like everything else in this country, has a history rife with deep-rooted queerphobia, anti-queer legislation, and gross neglect for anyone who's not a white, cis, hetero male.
What? Oh no, she did not!
Now, don't get me wrong, American cinema mirrors its country, so it's a stratified hierarchical system, in which we're not all being the same way. But that's a deeper discussion for a different video. Today's discussion is largely about the modern day implications of queerphobia, particularly in film and media, and the history that got us there. Even as anti-queerphobic legislation is being passed and LGBTQ representation is becoming more pervasive or more evident on our screens, I still wonder if the everyday lives of queer folks is actually radically changing. I mean, we're more visible across the political, pop cultural, and media landscape. But what does that really mean? Are we better off now that stories like Pose and Moonlight exist and expose a kind of nuanced queer life that people didn't know existed before? I don't know. No. And honestly, in all of this instability and confusion and inconsistency, for so many of us, we find our refuge and our safe spot in a space where we can dream. And that would be film, media, and television. So today I want to explore that medium. I want to explore the way queer people have been represented in the most popular forms of media and the impact that it's had on real queer life, everyday queers. Because this stuff doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Or does it? Let's find out on today's episode of Unpopular Intersection. Child, we're gonna wait some shit up for real. Hey, yo, world. Welcome and welcome back to my corner of the internet. If this is your first time ever seeing my face, my name is Herby. Herby Revolus. My pronouns are he, she, him, or hers, and hers. And yes, that does mean that I wear pants, skirts, frozen person. If you're new here, you probably don't know what the Unpopular Intersection is, and it's this new segment on my channel that I'm starting out where I combine the things that I'm really deeply interested in, pop cultural topics, and anything that's been popular in media, film, or television, music, and intersecting that with a kind of critical eye, a critical lens, and an intersectional feminist lens to be specific. Today will be no different. I think it's important to start off with the big question. So why does everyone say that representation is important? Why is that so ubiquitous? Initially, when I was creating this video, I was going in multiple different directions, like I do with a lot of my videos, particularly the ones where I want to be critical and analytical in this kind of way. I was thinking about talking about straight passing or masculine privilege, particularly within the gay community. But I settled on focusing on the kind of denigrating and caricaturistic ways that we as all queer people have been depicted across the BLT community in film and media. Now, if you want to hear those topics, I still have those notes in my computer. So if you want to hear them, then maybe that's something that I'll do on the community space that I create. Link in the bio to join the email newsletter so you'll be the first to know when my Patreon arrives and be the first to join. Yes, that was a shameless plug, girl, please. No, but seriously, comment down below if that's something that you think you'd be interested in seeing. So yes, representation is important because we need to see ourselves. More importantly, we need to see ourselves expressed humanely. I need to see profound, interesting, multiplex depictions of queer humans because at the end of the day, we're still human. But I think even more important than that is the fact that media and television act as a kind of historical document, right? And a declaration that we exist and we've always existed. So many people aren't picking up sex and gender novels or the history of queer folk. Like, people are not reading those things. They're not engaging with that material. So seeing yourself reflected in something that people can sit down and say, this is a space of entertainment, but still understand that, like, oh, these people at the very least exist. And that way we can't have the kinds of conversations that are happening now, like, oh, the trans thing is new. What's happening? American education is failing all of the girls. And more importantly, and more specific to this video, American media is failing the girls. And honestly, I think we can't have a real conversation about the deleterious nature of queer representation on screen without first going back to the inception of how queer people showed up, when we were eradicated, how we were coded, and how all of those eras have simultaneously impacted the lives of queer people moving through life in real time, particularly queer people of color. Film and media has been a part of Americans' lives since the late 19th century. In the early 20th century, we were seeing depictions of queer folk, not revolutionary depictions, not anything that I would say is a positive. There was an acknowledgement that we existed. But it was introduced to the American population in the only way that America knows how to do things in a remotely acceptable way. with white, gay, and lesbian women and men being at the forefront. There was no representation of lesbian and gay queer people of color. Girl, what? Straight people of color was barely, wasn't.
I have never been one to strike fear into anybody's hearts when I enter the room or you know, first appear on screen. Because of it, then, this idea of a gay man with AIDS is not scary.
What these stories lacked in depth and rich text, they made up for in the standard practice of racial exclusionary politics. But alas, even centering whiteness wouldn't stop the evangelical church and white bourgeoisie of Hollywood from joining forces to eradicate the explicit and overt representation of many things, like, you know, profanity, suggestive nudity, but yes, you guessed it, sexual proclivity. This was known as the Hays Code. If you follow along, art imitated life or life imitated art. I mean, I don't know, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Like, what are we talking about here? Real attitudes towards queer folk that relegated us to live in the shadows informed the way we showed up on TV because we were relegated to exist only in subtext. This is what's known as queer coding. It's a subtextual coding or implication that a character is queer. Honestly, I don't want to focus too much on that because even after the Hays Code, we still didn't get the rich and sophisticated text that I think we were owed with regard to queer representation on television. And that's because the only reference of how queer people should show up were the references that we had from the queer coding that existed during the Hays era, right? Even today, some of the same themes still remain. We're still misrepresented, villainized, and many of us erased. My thought is, anyone who's writing a script involving queer characters, come close. Treat me like a delicate Amazon package. Bitch, I'm fragile, so handle me with care. Thanks. And that is it, right? That's the meat and potatoes of today's video. The kinds of representation that we had to endure during the period of erasure, aka the Hays Code era. But also how the same tropes and archetypes still exist to this day. Let's get into it. We're moving into the next chapter. Queer archetypes and tropes. Girl, let me take a drink. I don't want to be obtuse here. I want to provide you with specific kinds of portrayals to castigate, to identify the tropes most pervasive and consistent throughout the history of queer representation in film. Now keep in mind, this doesn't mean that the tropes and archetypes that I bring up in this video have been the most harmful or even necessarily the most dangerous. It just means that I want to provide us with a kind of framework and a lens through which to look at queer representation and the kind of radical change the girls are saying. We've come so far. We're in a post-homophobic society. We are not, mama. Now let's start with a hot topic. Let's start off spicy. The portrayal of the sissy.
Be careful of my ass.
We gotta get down on the stage.
I don't care. I won't allow you to ruin them.
I had thoughts about using this term sissy because in my research I saw that term used a lot to portray really hyper feminine men, but really we can extend it to non-binary folk who show up and they are incredibly effeminate and usually exist in identifiably male bodies. And so I'm like, ooh, sissy was a word lobbed at me over and over again and something about it just doesn't sound right rolling off of my tongue. I'm a kind of person where I'm like, I like to use radical language and language that the girls try to use as an ad hominem attack because I want to reclaim the power. That's me. If you feel uncomfortable, my apology in advance. As I said, the sissy was a hyper-feminine, gay, queer, male, or non-binary character, usually existing in a male body, often depicted as cowardly, existing in opposition to everything that males were taught to or aspire to. There's usually no focus on their romantic or intimate lives, right? But that seems to be changing. We'll get into that. I think it's important also to note that this is one of the first portrayals of queerness on screen, obviously. The male bodies are always going to be prioritized in a patriarchal society. I hate it here. Now, I'm not saying that the representation was positive. I actually think it was disgusting.
Sad, believe me, missy, when you're born to be a sissy without the feminine vibe.
I am saying that, as I just mentioned, representation is important and existence is better always than erasure. I also think that because this is one of the oldest forms of queer representation in television, it leads people to believe that gay men are one of the oldest forms of queerness that exist. And while obviously that isn't true, aside from religious texts that hyperfixate on gay and subsequently lesbian sexual interaction with no focus at all on the other queer forms of sexual intimacy, but that, again, is a deeper conversation for a different day. It's obviously not true that, gayness is the oldest form of queerness because trans people have always been around us. Two-spirited people have always been around us. If we extend our minds and our purviews beyond the colonized Western understanding of the queer experience, then we'll understand that, girl, Black folk, African folk have been trans for thousands of years. Mwah. I honestly think that this group is particularly interesting because it's very lucrative for Hollywood. The sissy archetype is so lucrative. They love it. They love it. I would be remiss not to point out the comedization factor and the kind of dehumanization that comes along with that. These sissies exist only as a tool for satisfaction, primarily of women, but of the audience in general, right? So there's no humanizing factor. And there's also an intentional desexualization of the sissy, right? They don't get access to being sexualized, to romanticism, to intimacy, right? And that's something that's so, that comes so natural to so many humans. And I don't mean to be offensive to my asexual sisters, brothers, and siblings, but I'm saying for so many of us that comes natural, right? And sissies are denied the opportunity to show up in that way, and why is that? Particularly during the Hays Code era, we see a kind of queer coding and asexualization of queer characters with a hyperfixation on the support of sissies and making women feel beautiful and men feel more masculine. Sissies teach little boys what not to be, right? And they kind of aid in that disdain that little boys have for effeminate boys and men. And they kind of simultaneously also exist as a beautification tool for straight women or women in general to use in their lives, right? How can you benefit me with your queerness? That's what you're made to do. You are my resource. You are my tool. Do the thing that you're supposed to do. I've always seen you do it. You're funny on TV. You're great at making a person's life more fun and more fab. Do that thing. Show up for me in that way, and that will warrant a positive response from me. If you show up in any other way that is human, I think there's a kind of disgust that comes along with that, and we see a kind of queer phobia even from women who have traditionally been a safe space for gay men, right? This is no shade to either men or women. I'm just talking in general. Anyone who's an ally, you're an ally. An unhit dog does not need to holler, okay? And we see the evolution of the sissy in contemporary movies through the gay BFF. I think Damien is the perfect example of this.
She doesn't even go here.
Because his main personality trait is the fact that he's a gay best friend. He has very little complexity of his own outside of being a part of the storyline and making the storyline more fun and fab. And I do see contemporary culture and contemporary movies trying to make an effort to sexualize effeminate men and non-binary folk, i.e. Uncle Clifford. But I also see the kind of repulsion that a sex scene like that is met with from within and without the queer community. If you're tuned in like I'm tuned in to Twitter or P-Valley, you've seen that Uncle Clifford got a happy ending from a man that he met at the club on his birthday, right? And there was this huge uproar of all the kinds of sex scenes we could have seen, why Uncle Clifford? And I think that, okay, yeah, it's funny. People are just being funny because maybe they personally don't see Uncle Clifford in that way.
We interrupt today's programming to bring you Editing Herby. While editing this video, I'm realizing that when I was speaking, I was consistently vacillating between the actual actor themselves, the character, and the larger real-life issue that I was trying to speak to. And in doing so, I didn't use Uncle Clifford's preferred pronouns. If I remember correctly, I think Uncle Clifford uses he, him pronouns a couple times in the show, but it's overwhelmingly she, her, and there is no excuse for not addressing Miss Mamas as she is. Well, 368,468 always address Miss Mamas as she, her. Thank you.
He shows up in a very nurturing and maternal way throughout the couple seasons. So I won't take that away from this story. But what I will say is we are socialized to despise femininity that we cannot sexualize or that we don't have a sexual reaction to. So when you desexualize feminine gay men and society already hates femininity, there is no safe space, even in the gay community, for feminine gay men to feel desirable and to express the natural human interaction that so many of us have, with the exception of asexual people, to just bisexual beings. There's not safe space created, and it's not because you are not attracted to feminine gays. We know y'all are attracted both, top, bottom, and verse. You enjoy these things. I think you're socialized to be repulsed by the femininity existing in a person who we expect to show up as masculine, particularly in a person embodying the body that Uncle Clifford embodies, being a darker, bigger, or plusher girl. We expect him to show up as hypermasculine because of the way that black men are hypermasculinized. I don't know. I could be here all day and I don't want to spend too much time on one category. I want to go to the other categories, and I have so many other schools of thought, which is why I'm like, girl, I need to go ahead and start the community page so I can do extended versions of these videos because there's so much more to be said. The depraved homosexual. Now this one is no respecter of the L, the G, the B, the T, the Q, the I, or the A, or the BLT. Everybody can get it. All non-hetero performances of sensuality, sexuality, or sexual proclivity are viewed as a perversion, as something morally corrupt, wicked even. During the Hays Code era, when you couldn't even say gay, there still existed a decision to code gay folk as villainous, evil characters. The inference that a character was queer was always coupled with pathological behavior or villainous behavior, mischievous, untrustworthy behavior. And so how can you not begin to correlate queerness with immorality? Why would you text me if I'm recording a video? When non-hetero forms of sexual behavior or intimate or romantic behavior, just romantic, right? Or performance, just showing up as someone who we understand on screen is not heterosexual, is always linked to depraved characters, you begin to think, even as an ally, that queerness is something that we should whisper about. It's kitchen table talk. It's not something that should be discussed or displayed in public. And certainly never, ever, under any circumstances, displayed around children. Because it's perverse. It's perverted. And even as your homegirl, even as your ally, must we talk about that around kids? I don't want to influence them. Because gayness has powers. Girl, I can't. I won't. And I think movies like Rope, which queer code characters as murderous lunatics and lesbians as vampires, these things all add up for people to see us as some other wicked, perverted thing. And can never see us as just as complicated as heteros. This pattern still continues. It shows up in even progressive shows that I would say have more progressive representations of queer folk. They still enforce this stereotype in a way that's often ignorant. For example, Orange is the New Black. Love the show so bad. Why is it depicting a dark-skinned black lesbian woman who has the least access to traditional femininity under the white supremacist lens as a mentally impaired lesbian, and then making space for the white lesbians to have nuanced, complex, romantic depictions? Is that evolution? Evolution for who? Or Carl from For Color Girls engaging in same-sex intermarital affairs and contracting HIV and potentially passing that on to Janet Jackford White.
So you doing the bending?
The focus is not on the fact that he really is a cheater. The focus is on the fact that he's given her this wicked, evil, gay, chronic disease that now fucks up her entire life.
When I get back, I want you gone. Take your HIV with you.
And while I do think no one wants to get a chronic illness, I'm just thinking, who wrote that? Did it need to be written? Do we need to consistently depict black gay men as mischievous and as bringing black women HIV? Because I think so many black women are going to receive that in a way that, like, that's why black women are receiving HIV in higher numbers or contracting HIV in higher numbers, which, first of all, let's say there is nothing wrong with people who have HIV, right? Just like people who have various different chronic illnesses or, ailments or what have you, and they're living with them and they're living full, robust, healthy lives. as do people with HIV. I actually think the life expectancy is well into the 70s or 80s. Don't quote me, but it's a very long life. Why create this story around this black woman contracting HIV from her black husband who's been having sex with gay men, when we could actually create a story that talks about the fact that black women are not believed by their healthcare professionals and they grow up in food deserts. They're more likely to come in contact with all kinds of ailments because they don't have access to the same kind of healthcare that white women have access to. Why can't that be the storyline? Right? But no, we want to repeat the same kind of things that we know are going to land on hetero, cisgender people's ears as negative and depraved queer people. All they do is bring illness every time. Or even Nate's character from Euphoria, who is clearly dealing with, mental issues. It's written like that's all linked to his internal struggle with his queerness, which actually brings me to the next archetype, the homophobic closeted jock. Let's get into it. This individual is violent and vitriolic in their homophobic abuse. And let's be more expansive because this extends beyond just jocks, right? And beyond just male identified individuals. This goes to women who show up in these roles, men, and people who are not just jocks. I would even extend it to the abusive trade, child, but that's another video. The queer jock acts as a euphemism for a character like Nate who's struggling with their sexuality and abuses those who he's most attracted to. It kind of feels like an old stereotype that exists in the heterosexual community, like, if he likes you, he'll hit you. That's not cute, right? Like, we're not gonna glamorize domestic violence, right? Thanks. We've seen this depiction of queer folks in films like Perks of a Wildflower, with Brad as the closeted jock, and in shows like Glee, Sex Education, and Euphoria, where people who are dealing with their sexuality and struggling with coming out about that are abusive with their internalized homophobia. Honestly, I think a story about internalized homophobia is important. We need to see that. And there was a time when these kinds of depictions were revolutionary. But now it's redundant, and the ubiquity of those stories is kind of propelling us in the wrong direction, right? I actually am in favor of seeing different kinds of internalized homophobia depicted on the screen. Because there are effeminate gay men who are very homophobic and transphobic. There are masculine lesbian women who hate the gays. And so I would like to see a more robust depiction of internalized homophobia. I think it absolves feminine gay men and masculine gay women of really contending deeply with our own internalized homophobia and how that shows up, and the kinds of harm and abuse that we inflict on trans people and gay people and lesbian people every day. Right? Because there's an archetype, there's an idea for us to look at, there's an image. And as long as we don't fit that image, then we don't have to do that work. We're all absolved from doing that work once there's an archetype in place and it becomes so ubiquitous. So no, I'm tired of seeing the closeted homophobic jock and having that be his excuse for abusing people without adding that critical lens of looking at the social structures that inform that internalized homophobia, without looking at the social structures that create a space for people not to come out, right? Where people are abused and beat when people see feminine traits in boys. I can't necessarily say the same thing for lesbians, and lesbians, speak up in the comments. I think there's space created even by creating the language and the term tomboy. There's no such thing as a tomgirl. Not in the black community. Not in the black community. I also think, like, random thought when we start talking about who gets to show up as what and like the kind of work that's being absolved from us. I think it's interesting the kinds of people that, and I'm talking to my black folk here, that we accept as queer, right? Like, think deeply about your femphobia. Why is it that the black community responded so positively to Cleo from Set It Off, a masculine lesbian woman? Why is it that the black community responded so positively to Chiron, right, from Moonlight, a masculine gay man? I loved Moonlight. I think we need to expand the kinds of depictions we see of black queer people, of Latinx queer people. We need to see it all. Thanks. It's interesting that we respond positively and we can take seriously the masculine gay man and the masculine gay woman, because it speaks to the kind of femphobia that so many of us have been socialized into. We create space for certain kinds of queer people to show up. But if you show up as feminine, when I've been taught to hate the feminine that I can't sexualize or that I don't find sexy,
I don't take you seriously if you don't show up as funny, and I despise you even if you are not comedicized. Do that work. That was just something that just came to my mind. Do that work. You think about that deeply and you get back to me on that one. Now, hold on. Okay, and finally, because I've been here for a long time and I don't want to stay here too long, we all know this one. Again, this one is no respecter of the B, the L, or the T community. Right, beet, bacon, lettuce, and tomato. The Promiscuous Queer. I think each different letter gets a different kind of promiscuity ascribed to us. But I think gay men, whenever you see gay men on screen, you need to focus on their sexuality. Every time people see gay men, they think about in a booty. That's it. In a booty. Right? We're not allowed to be carpenters, architects, film directors, doctors. We just exist as sexual objects who enjoy having sex with men, and people kind of make space for them. And they're like, well, men are visual. Men are sexual. Men are more sexual than women, so I think you guys just have sex all the time. Right? And I think that that's weird. You're annoying. Even as a non-binary, effeminate gay person. Bisexual people, there's a kind of promiscuity that is associated with them that's also associated with untrustworthiness, right? I don't know if I want to be with you because if you cheat on me, you could cheat on me with a man or a woman, and I don't feel safe, right? And so that to me is weird. Trans people are viewed as just sexual objects, right? That can be thrown around left and right. They don't exist as real people. They're circus animals to so many people, right? Even people who are trans attracted, they would never be trans romantically invested. Not never be, because I'm not putting that on my trans sisters and brothers, right? I know you're loved and you're deserving of love and you will get love, period. But I'm saying in the broader scheme of how they're represented in media. Lesbian women, I feel like there's no seriousness given to their sexual exclusions. These lesbian women like women. But men still feel like this is a space for them to show up, particularly if those lesbian women are feminine. Right. I'm going to disrespect and walk all over your sexual orientation and say like, oh, you don't just want to try it. You don't just want to try it. No respect to that. So promiscuity is ascribed to all of us, regardless of which letter we are, or if there hasn't been a letter created for us. So just to conclude this all off, and I want to kind of go off the top of my head with this, my issue with the way we've shown up, I think there's been so much progression. I do like P-Valley. I deeply love Pose, right? I think there's been so much representation and nuance and complexity added to the way that we are depicted on screen as queer folk. But I also think that it's important that we always add a critical eye when people show up on screen, because one, we need evidence that we exist and that we're human and that we're not caricatures. Because when people see us on screen, it teaches them how to engage with us, how to respond to us, and how to treat us in real life. Understand that. And oftentimes queer representation on TV mirrors the representation and the interactions that queer people are having in real life. So the progression that we're having on screen, yes, may be jarring to little Duval. Please go somewhere. It's necessary. It's necessary that we see ourselves and that we show up. I have so many other thoughts, but I've been here for so long and I don't want to take up too much of your time. I know this video is so long and I'm going to have a lot of editing to do, but it's okay. I do it for you because I love you. What are your thoughts about queer representation in television throughout the history of television? What are your thoughts about where we are? Do you believe the narrative that we're in a post-queer-phobic society? I can't get with the girls who say that kind of stuff. I love you real bad. I'm glad that I was able to get this video out, something thoughtful, something that's been on my mind. You know we do a lot of things here, pop culture analysis, film and media synthesis, and yes, I do scream occasionally on Beyonce's internet to music videos that I enjoy. Girl, please. I love to embarrass myself. I love you too bad, but you know I can never let you go without saying this. Don't just live your truth. That's selfish. Live the truth. There's a difference. Mwah. I love you. Bye, homegirl.